Good evening, everyone. This is yet another important theme in this course called Contemporary Discourses in Water Sector, and the theme is of water security. In this lecture, usually which I take in the offline mode for 4 hours, but here it might vary around one and a half hour the core content. We are going to look at the emergence of this idea itself, the water security. What is its conceptual sort of underpinning, how the concept has been defined, and how different it is really in terms of the perspective. I have divided this into four parts, also for the ease of recording, because otherwise it gets too lengthy. The first part would discuss quickly about the idea and its emergence, its various definitions, the variability of scales at which water security is defined and measured. Second part of this recording would be focusing on various indicators and limitations of indicators. Now, we had looked at some part of this in our water poverty discussion as well, that how indicators are important or thought to be important, and how those have been deployed in different ways or in using different methods at different scales for assessing the availability and use of water across the sectors or across the regions, etc., etc. Here also, since water security also tries to come up with another indicator, they do, I mean, the proponents or the set of scholars who try to develop and popularize this concept also have their own comments on existing indicators and how those are limited, etc., etc. Their stake is slightly different than the set of scholars who developed water poverty. Hence, we will little bit get into this discussion also. The third part would be then whether water security is a catch-all concept which tries to take everything under the umbrella or tries to capture, measure everything which is possible in the water sector, or is it really a solid statistical exercise with a new indicator which is much better than the earlier attempts of building indices. And also then from indices to a perspective, how those set of scholars who are involved in developing this actually put it across, and how also they did a successful advocacy of. So that would be the last part of this entire uh, set of lectures. This particular part is based on a paper written by Karen Baker. Now, I think by now all of you know this scholar who is quite popular in water sector, mainly because of her studies in urban water from different angles. So she was trying to understand the emergence of the idea of water security itself, and she wrote a paper in 2010 in which she tried to do a systematic literature review. Some of you might know this term, systematic literature review, and how it is done. Recently, it has emerged as one of the very strong and method people often employ to do research, which people consider is complete in itself. So, secondary based literature, sorry, the researchers who do their research on the basis of secondary data try to systematize it using particular types of techniques of searching the literature, using particular databases, like this graph is showing the database uh, Karen Baker used was the Web of Science database. Use particular keywords, then download heavy amount of literature which focuses on that particular idea or concept which the researcher is studying, and they then filter out irrelevant literature and focus on key selected articles which they study in depth, analyze using their own research questions. So, here Karen Baker was trying to understand the emergence of water security as a concept when it started coming in the academic literature. Also in the popular literature, how different people conceptualized it, different people tried to understand what meaning it gave to different scholars, etc., etc. And in this particular slide, she shows that by between 2010 and 1990, there were quite a bit of literature which came or which used this concept of water security, and her classification shows that after 2000 especially, the literature using this concept increased substantially. So she found that empirical studies were, she found at least 44 instances of empirical studies which were focused on understanding water security. There were 30 modeling exercises which used water security. So different kinds of researchers using this concept. Purely conceptual theoretical discussion, there were 15 papers which she found in Web of Science database, and there were 4 lab based studies as well. Actually, after 2010, what has happened in terms of research on water security would be an interesting thing to know. But unfortunately, such a systematized study is not available. Otherwise, I would have referred to it and updated this presentation. But after showing this kind of classification of what kind of researchers use what kind of studies, in her paper, Karen Baker shifts to the some of the definitions of water security, or to tries to understand that how people define what do they mean by, etc., etc. So in general, she finds that the definitions of water security used in 1990s were linked to either specific human security issues, even military security. So because security is a term which is widely used, but its basic use is about, you know, security in the sense of defense, in the sense of protecting national boundaries. Some of the water security discussion, especially might be based in the Middle Eastern context, is also found which links security or water security with the national security. So she finds certain references to that as well. But that is, I think, a very preliminary and raw kind of understanding of water security, otherwise, what we understand today. There were also instances that water security was used in the sense of, uh, in connection with food security, and little rarely, but also environmental security. In the year of 2000, in Second World Forum, the Global Water Partnership introduced an integrative definition of water security. It said that access and affordability of water as well as human needs and ecological health. Now, somehow I keep on comparing the ways people approach and develop certain terms, or how a particular concept acquires a certain structure and meaning. And if you compare the way here scholars are approaching water security with the way scholars had approached water poverty, you will find certain similarities also. Then a variety of scholars and policymakers, she finds that they had taken up the term and given its various meanings. And she finds diverse literature, and within them, she finds that there are 4 interrelated themes dominate in the context of water security. So when you talk about water security, one is you have to talk about water availability, another human vulnerability to hazards. So maybe in a situation of water abundance, there might be a water insecure situation, and typical examples come from flood prone areas where there is everywhere water, but water is destroying the resources, water is destroying the human life, or not just by drowning them or destroying their farms or assets, but simply lack of availability of potable water. So human vulnerability to hazards is an important aspect which should be considered while understanding the water security situation on ground, on in real terms. Then another theme comes up, that is the theme of human needs, where a lot of development related literature or development angle considers basic human needs. We had looked at this approach in water poverty as well, which reflects here as well, and also with the with an emphasis on food security. So availability of sufficient water to farmers so that they can produce enough food, not for themselves but also for the entire country or region, which is fed by the agriculture from a particular area. So, in human needs approach, linkage with food security is a very strong theme, and food security itself uses the term security. So, it is a natural extension of that approach to water sector as well. And the fourth obviously is the sustainability. So water availability, human vulnerability to hazards, human needs, and sustainability were the stronger themes at that point in time between 1990 and 2000, which were associated with the term water security. So definition is one particular way of understanding, but another big challenge is application, and we have been confronting with this particular complex problem of scales. So when you talk of water security, what scales you are talking about, at which scale would you like to uh, apply the term? And in this context, Karen Baker finds that different types of studies, we have already seen them in last to last slide when we saw the basic classification of types of studies like empirical and modeling, conceptual, etc. She finds that in each of the type there is certain sense of scale. So empirical studies, she finds that either are talking water security at community scale or municipal scale or hydraulic infrastructure scale. Now hydraulic infrastructure and municipal can be different because there are cities within which there can be different governing units. For example, in South America, so not Latin America, southern part of America, you might have heard this very famous city called Phoenix in the state of Arizona, where there are six counties. So each county is a different governing unit, but the hydraulic infrastructure which supplies water to these six counties would be common because it might be drawing water from a particular source, and the retail distribution is organized in such a way where the political boundaries of the counties and the hydraulic boundaries of the city water distribution might get crisscross or overlap. So hydraulic infrastructure can itself be a particular scale. So empirical studies are focusing when they try to understand water security on ground, either on community, municipal, or hydraulic infrastructure as a scale. She found such four studies in her literature review. Then subnational watersheds or drainage basins, then even regional scales where you talk about provinces or state, or subnational is the another term in some countries which basically gives us a sense of like a state, and then nation state, and even supranational, more than one country or more than two countries. So, but in modeling category, she finds literally 10 studies which were talking about no scale. And in terms of community, municipal, or subnational, there were only six studies. There were studies at the nation scale or nation state scale. There were almost 11 studies, and two or more countries, there were five studies. Might be, modelers do sustainability assessment a lot, and modeling is an exercise where larger scale data processing is possible. So might be you see that empirical studies try and tend to focus much more on, of course depending on the data, at different levels or different scales, but modeling you find more at the macro scale. Obviously lab based studies and conceptual studies won't talk about scale because that is not an applied sort of a study. Lab based might be applied, but we don't know. We need to find what she found actually in terms of how lab based studies were using water security. So the whole issue or whole objective behind getting into the scales and definitions is to understand whether water security as a term is relevant. What does it capture? How would it help actually to policymakers in different ways to assess? Can it become a regulatory tool? The similar concerns which we discussed in the context of water poverty as well. And then you understand the scales, you understand the definition, and by then you understand the scope. By then you understand its applicability. By then you understand the relevance, etc., etc. I think that was the motive why Karen Baker was getting into this kind of a study. So she also tried to understand which subject areas or which sectors the water security is being used, and how those were being used also, with what sense, with what definition. Those subject areas are trying to understand the term water security. So in agriculture, she finds more in the sense of input and output. So input to agriculture production and food security, so availability, input, and if there is sufficient water for agricultural production, then that is, or that can be called as a water secure agriculture maybe. In an engineering sense or engineering type of studies, she found it more in the sense of protection against water related hazards, so floods, droughts, contamination of water, or even terrorism. A couple of studies were mentioning, because terrorist activities in the Middle East, especially this context, I think is coming from this Ethiopia, Somalia, Egypt, Blue Nile, White Nile, that entire that issue. I think there a lot of terrorist activities were linked to using water more as a weapon rather than uh, you know uh, just water. And some of these discussions we had in the water conflicts course, might not all remember because few of you were part of that course or had subscribed that course. Now that's the engineering context. In environmental science or environmental studies context, water security was looked at as access to water functions and services for humans and the environment, more from the role of water in ecosystem environment services, or in a sense of water availability in terms of quality and quantity, minimizing impacts of hydrological variability, that is climate variability. Same, I mean the same variability concept applied in the hydrological sense here. The studies pertaining to fisheries, geology, geosciences, hydrology also look at water security in the context of hydrological or hydrologic variability. Hmm. They also look at water security in connection with security of the entire hydrological cycle. So obviously it is indirectly getting linked with the climate variability here. The public health studies focus on supply security and access to safe water. So contamination, quality, portability, all those concerns get reflected in the water security. So water availability is there but not potable water, so you use that situation to term as water insecure situation. And this large category of studies, I mean, she brought in so many disciplines together as one category here. The social sciences, where anthropology, economics, geography, history, law, management, and political science, she considers as social science as one category. They look at water security in the sense of drinking water infrastructure security. So one aspect of it, or input to food production and human health and well-being. So obviously these are overlapping things. Although she has created and classified water security understanding as per the subject area, it is not that the understanding of one subject area is not overlapping with another. Social science also looked at armed conflict, violent conflict, and water security in conjunction with each other. They do talk about minimizing household vulnerability to hydrological variability, because geographers would like to look at that. The policy literature also looks at water security in interdisciplinary terms. So they try to link everything, because policy itself is an interdisciplinary science. So policy literature talks about floods, climate, energy, economy, and human security together. It looks at water security in the context of sustainable development. It talks about protection against water related hazards. Obviously, policy would try and cover up all other subject areas together. It is in a sense a synthetic kind of a subject area in itself. And then the water resources itself has a subject area, where scarcity, supply security, this Falcon marks categorization of green versus blue, that all has reflected in the water resource studies, um, in the sense of water security. So wide range of applicability. Basically, she is trying to tell us that water security is an attractive term. It is a potent term. It has a lot of potential to be applied in widest possible ways in different subject areas. So she also looks at some broader and more determined efforts to define water security. She gives us three examples, and I'm going to read each of that definition for you here. She quotes Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies definition, which is more of a think tank, but how, despite having a context of peace and security studies, it looks at water security more broadly beyond the defense context. The definition is: water security is essential for human access to health, well being, economic, and political stability. It is essential to limit the risk of water related hazards, a complete and fair valuation of the resource, sustainability of ecosystems at all parts of hydrologic cycle, and an equitable and cooperative sharing of water resources is very necessary. So, lot of angles are sort of clubbed in the understanding of water security, where defense is not left, but beyond defense, the societal concerns have reflected in Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies approach to define water security. Another definition, which comes from a very big multilateral NGO called WaterAid, it defines water security as as a comprehensive definition of water security, goes beyond availability to issues access. So it doesn't limit itself to just availability, but it needs to get into the access related issues. Access involves issues that range from a discussion of fundamental individual rights to national sovereignty rights over water. Now, I would like to appeal you to remind our discussions about water sovereignty in the water conflicts class. It also involves issues of water security exposed. The third definition comes from, which she refers to, obviously, from Patricia Wouters. Patricia Wouters is a legal scholar based in Dundee. At least she was in Dundee for a long time because she was one of the leaders who developed water law program, masters in water law program in Dundee, University of Dundee, which is supported by UNESCO like IHE Delft. So the nuances in her definition are quite different than the other two. She defines water security in terms of equity and affordability, and the role of state in and markets in water allocation, pricing, distribution, and regulation. Water security also implies social and political decision making on use. The priority to be accorded to competing household, agricultural, or industrial demands on the resource. So Wouters doesn't talk here about access per se, but talks about everything which would otherwise influence the access. She talks about state, simultaneously she talks about market. When she talks about market, obviously she will have to talk about regulatory angle and then equity and affordability also. And much more law and economics kind of an approach in defining the water security here. So the definitions expose certain weaknesses. That's how the conclusions are. One weakness is that these definitions have a very poor handle on the quantity plus quality of flows involved. So, like water poverty was talking about, lot of quantity oriented assessment of water situation. These definitions do not talk about that. That's the first observation. And second observation is there is also poor understanding of the interdependency, she calls it. So the discussion goes further to some fundamental concepts which are related to water security or the term security in the first place. So security would mean what? Freedom from fear or then freedom from want, which signifies the stability, some kind of stability. So if you come from dependency theory, now dependency theory otherwise is very well known in terms of how western countries are dependent on the developing countries for the natural resources, which are the basis for entire economy or industrial production, which leads towards an affluent society or a prosperous society. But if one draws something from that, that tells us that if there is no stability, there is no security. So there is an inherent interlinkage between these two terms, stability and security. And hence, by drawing from that, one can say that no security without stability. So stability is the first kind of condition, the precondition for security. If you have stable flows, if you have stable stock, if you have stable uh, 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 source, then you would go towards a secure situation. That's one. Second, one would infer from the sustainability theory. No security, no stability without sustainability. So, whatever stability situation or stable situation one is aspiring for has to also sustain. So, the understanding of security then goes beyond, because see here the term security is trying to acquire certain meaning by associating and comparing it with other competing concepts, and also tries to understand that which is a concept of higher order. So stability, sustainability are definitely are the concepts at the lower order, because without satisfying these two conditions of stability and sustainability, one can't call that the situation is secure. So water security inherently talks about stability and sustainability. So I am not drawing here Venn diagrams, but obviously if one tries to draw Venn diagram, the circle of security would be bigger, in which the circles of stability and sustainability would be drawn or would lie inside that. So with this, I would like to end this first part of small part of the lecture, which basically tries to understand about the definitions of water security and its emergence. Karen Baker talks a lot about water security in her paper from the critic point of view. I am not getting into that right now, because the focus of this lecture is not getting into the critiques per se, but to understand the emergence of the concept and how the concept developed, etc. etc. In the next part, we will mainly talk about the review of indicators which the proponents of water security did, and what did they find in that, and how did they build on the existing indicators to go towards a meaningful indicator for water security. Now, let me highlight this here, that water security has not found a particular destination yet. It is still an evolving concept, and interestingly, University of East Anglia in United Kingdom has 2 years full-time master's program on water security itself. And in the last part of this lecture, we are going to refer something from that also. The scholars who teach this in this program in University of East Anglia have compiled or edited a book on water security itself, and I have uploaded that entire book as an additional reading on the TESOL web page. So if some of you are interested, please download that book, and maybe after this master's program you may be interested to look at some of the chapters of that book.